Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to get into a video that was recommended a couple of different times on the Discord. This is the Gripen, What We Must Learn from Sweden, and it looks like from the title card and all that when I was clicking on it that this is in reference to Sweden potentially joining NATO. So I'm curious kind of what direction they're going to come at this with, but let's go ahead and jump into it and see what it's about.
Recently, the Saab Jas-39 Gripen moved from beloved underdog to being put forward as a prime candidate, not just for Ukraine, but to serving as an inspiration of how NATO countries can use fighter jets in a dispersed posture with decentralized logistics, support, and maintenance. Gripen gives the Swedish Air Force and other countries a low-cost, lightweight fighter platform that is very capable. But the question remains whether Gripen or the Swedish Air Force model of operations can be integrated, adapted, or absorbed among NATO countries. In this video, I want to talk to you about Gripen, why its use in a force is more than just about a platform, and what the secret ingredients are for the Swedes, and why this may not work for everyone. Joining me too is Professor Justin Bronk from the Royal United Services Institute and Dr. Sophie Antrobos from the Freeman Air and Space Institute to give you an all-round appreciation of Sweden's Air Force model and the limitations for NATO. I'd also be very interested to hear your thoughts on this. Let me know in the comments how suited you believe Gripen and the Swedish model is to NATO partners, and if we should adapt a similar way of handling things. This video is sponsored by Patreon and channel membership supporters. The support provided by you, my patrons and channel members, allows me to focus on producing content without relying on YouTube's recommendation algorithm, and it directly funds various projects like the Inside the Cockpit series and archive and research trips. As patrons and channel members, you receive early access to videos, have access to our Discord server, and you receive a free sign-up gift. Right now there are also a number of interviews with experts that are in early access, so you can watch those immediately on signing up. Have a look at the various support options in more detail in the description below, and now let's talk about Gripen and the Swedish Air Force model. With Gripen, we have an aircraft that is currently transitioning to what is sometimes referred to as 4.5 generation specs. Saab, especially if we compare it to some of the competitors like Lockheed Martin, really doesn't use the generational breakdown, but as a shorthand it is somewhat useful to situate Gripen in the fighter jet realm. In Sweden,
Yeah, we talked about this on the Discord just yesterday or day before yesterday about how this is becoming more common, not just with Sweden, but with countries all over the place, where they're making fighter jets that are, and not just fighter jets, all sorts of weapons platforms and systems that are more open system. They're much more upgradable, and the idea is to kind of like find a base model that works, and instead of putting all of this money and all of this time and effort and energy into these fighter programs where you're basically coming up with a new fighter from scratch, you instead sort of like integrate the new technology and sort of upgrade where you can on fighters that you already have. There are I feel like most countries do this at least to some extent, but this is becoming much more common with different sorts of fighter jets, where instead of doing the generational model, this is their way to sort of be like cost efficient with it. It's like the cost benefit analysis has pushed them into that direction, which I mean, I feel like as long as it's practical use and it works in the field, then like it kind of doesn't matter what generation it is. But let's keep going.
Sweden, the Gripen C force is currently transitioning to the Gripen E, which features an improved sensor suite, including a Swashblade AESA radar set, a more capable and integrated electronic warfare system, sensor fusion, 2 additional hardpoints, and a higher carrying capacity with a more powerful engine. Its cockpit has been redesigned to feature a single wide-angle display focusing on the main tactical information required for the pilot. It is an impressive aircraft for a country the size of Sweden, even if certain key components like the engine or various weapon systems come from other countries. The core strength of Gripen, however, is the ease of its maintenance and the designed ability to operate from dispersed runways. Through Gripen, the Swedish Air Force operates with the ability to quickly and effectively disperse fighter squadrons and wings from a handful of main bases to about 30 dispersal bases around the country. All Gripen needs is a straight tarmac, basically a road of 800 by 16 meters, which is surprisingly small considering it's a fighter jet, and a small ground crew of about 5 conscripts and 1 experienced crew chief. With everything that is needed for turnaround packed into a small convoy of about 1 to 2 trucks, Gripen provides a unique capability that is not mirrored in terms of specialization by any other comparable platform. That sounds impressive, and it is, but before I sound like I was sponsored here by Saab, I am not. As you know, Patreons and channel members are the ones that fund research trips, and one of them was, of course, recently to Saab, where I familiarized myself firsthand with Gripen and also got to chat with them on Gripen's and, of course, Sweden's capabilities. But let us now turn to the main question. Is Gripen dispersed operations and the Swedish Air Force model transferable to NATO? To a point, yes. There are lessons that NATO can or must learn from Sweden, but there are also, I would say, clear limitations. I will look at 4 main issues in order to integrate parts, at least, of the Swedish model into NATO air forces. Say countries, let's look at countries like Germany, Great Britain, France, or even the US, because in fact there is tightening cooperation between the US and the USAF and Sweden. So in order here to do this, we really need to think beyond the platform-centric approach that we commonly have and the assumptions that you can just make a switch happen by just buying a new platform. It doesn't work that way. So I'm going to go through this in chapters. First, I'm going to talk about Gripen itself, then I'm going to talk about basing, then training, and then the most important one, mentality. So sure, I don't want to stay platform-centric here, but this is in fact important. It's the key aspect to Gripen we must all accept. Gripen was built for dispersed operations, like no other Western fighter in service. Whether F-16, Typhoon, Rafale, you name it, none of those aircraft was designed with dispersal being a key component in the requirements. Of course, you can make an argument for some of the other planes, the old VTOL Harrier fleet, for example, or F-35B and C. But Harrier is going out of business, and F-35 is also not primarily meant for this. It'll be interesting to see, for example, how the Finns actually handle the F-35 platform, considering what they're doing is relatively similar to what Sweden does. Of course, that doesn't mean that other jets cannot disperse, but their requirements were different, so the jets themselves became different beasts, with, of course, resulting gives and takes, limiting their ease of use in dispersed operations compared to Gripen. With Gripen, you've got a small aircraft. I mean, look at it. I'm only 6'2", and it's tiny for a fighter. It is meant to land on short forest highways, be supported by a small team, and then it goes off again. All the important panels are easily accessed from the ground. You have a high-capacity auxiliary power unit for cold start requirements. You have automatic short runway landing procedures like the deflected canards. No other plane was designed like this or can be retrofitted into this. Gripen does what it is meant to do, That's its greatest strength. But also it has limitations in terms of power, range, and with some limits to the offensive weapon systems that it carries. But it perfectly fits the Swedish requirements and regional operational conditions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can transfer it to other countries. Talking about basing, it wasn't that long ago that NATO countries were still consistently conducting dispersal training as parts of their modus operandi. But since the Cold War, this was cut back, and the number of operating bases, main operating bases even, not just the dispersal ones, but those were reduced to an absolute minimum. While Western air forces, through the legacy of their operations over the past decades, can flexibly relocate parts of their force from A to B, they are heavily reliant on a very centralized system at home. Whether we are talking about one or two main repair and overhaul facilities, the heavy use of contractors, the logistic infrastructure, or the actual bases that can sustain high-intensity activity, it is a system that works within the required budgetary constraints.
This is sort of where the US lives, right? This is sort of their lane, is the logistics of it. It is the basically everything that costs a shit ton of money to do is sort of like the lane in which the US takes here. And I mean, I can kind of understand why. If it's something you can do, you can afford to do, and you know you do well, then I feel like that is going to give you like an operational leg up against basically anybody else fighting a fight that may not be centrally located, or it may be centrally located but in a state or country that is massive, which, you know, sort of automatically decentralizes it a bit. And so, yeah, this is kind of where the US lives. I've actually thought about this quite a bit in terms of the major ramp up that NATO is now having in regards to their military spending, military infrastructure, everything like that, versus what it had been when the Soviet Union fell. We are just now kind of coming into this explosion of NATO jumping back into, like, heavily into the military side of things. And I've kind of wondered this about how they're going to finagle this to make it work without sort of breaking the bank. Because, you know, they're going up, trying to get up to the 2% threshold. But, like, it's just they're in a position where a lot of the world, once the Soviet Union fell, kind of took a deep breath and took their foot off the gas in regards to the military. Like, it kind of just is what it is. And now they're in a position where things have to change, and they feel pressure because of the situation in Eastern Europe to, like, really start making moves quickly. And I'm very curious kind of how they get all of these moving pieces to work in a system that works for them.
And that is why we in the West have the air forces that we have. We are set around a specific budgetary efficiency rather than resilience. And that,
Except the US. The US budgetary efficiency is like an oxymoron when talking about US military spending.
moves from basing over to the training, over to the actual number of aircrafts that we have.
There's been a drive in that. This is true of all sorts of parts of the military, government, everywhere. A drive for efficiency over flexibility. So the way that the Ministry of Defence contracted out the military flying training system, as it's now called, was done on the basis of producing the right amount, no more, no less in theory, of aircrew at the right times. And if there's no flexibility or no fat in the system, if you like, then that makes it quite worrying in the military terms, because if for example we're involved in, for argument's sake, in a couple of years in fighting a major conflict, we can't buy 20 more F-35s and just order them, we'll have them next week, because we think, oh goodness, we need a few more platforms.
What this also means is that
Sure, this is kind of the general thing. This is kind of the general rub between push and pull logistics in general. And yes, it is very efficient as long as like nothing happens, as long as there's no bumps. But yeah, you get some bumps and you're gonna have some issues. Like that's that general rub, even for war fighting in general.
while Western Air Forces do have an expeditionary core or mindset, they are not set up for quick, active, decentralized, small-scale dispersal operations like Sweden. Sweden has the setup for this, from the aircraft to the small mobile dispersal teams and the actual sites where you disperse to, which other nations do not have.
The kind of core maintenance and tooling set and spares kits for a Gripen are delivered and kind of live in their main hangars on their main bases in 20-foot shipping containers that sort of plug into the side of the building, as it were, rather like trucks at a kind of supermarket distribution centre or something. You sort of reverse onto into the side of the hangar and become part of it at that point, but can then be quickly moved. And so because all the tools live in the shipping containers anyway, it's very, very quick and easy to just put those things on trucks and move them out. And then mobile teams can do the refueling, rearming, and all the protection and air traffic control and fire and rescue and everything else from vehicles in these dispersed locations for extended periods of time if they need to.
Yeah, what I'm wondering about here though is, are we talking about NATO as a group, or are we talking about NATO but the individual NATO countries? Because that makes a big difference. If you're referencing individual countries in NATO and then just kind of calling them NATO, this makes more sense to me. Because you're not only talking about like domestic defense, which is something you have to have, but everything is sort of surrounding your area and your ability to protect and move and have planes that are like quickly up in the air and all, refueling, all of that. If you're talking about NATO as a group, that becomes a little bit different in my opinion because of the absolutely overwhelming quantity. I mean, there's a video that is over the first day air operations of Desert Storm, and it's sort of absurd how many planes are in the air doing different things, going after different targets, coming off of carriers, coming off of bases. They're literally coming from all over the place. And you have drones, you have a bunch of different countries' aircraft that are sort of doing things that their aircraft are like more suited for. And so, like, if you're talking about NATO as a whole, I kind of think like quantity is sort of the quality on its own. And like, there's so many countries and so many bases and just so much of everything that like you could figure this stuff out really sort of no matter what you're bringing to the fight. But for individual countries, I think this sort of discussion is much more, it's much more suited for that, for the individual countries and sort of like their domestic doctrine.
Let's then talk about training. There is something that I often run into with Gripen, and that is, well, it's really an assumption that comes with Gripen, and that is because Sweden has this reliance on conscripts. Everything is set up in such a way that you don't need a specialty or specialty training, and that is not the case. Yes, Sweden relies on conscripts for Gripen turnaround, rearmament and refueling, but it also has a highly specialized force from the C2, so command and control, global eye, and of course it sets an extremely high standards on individual pilots themselves. While NATO
Yeah, we did the whole series on this on the Swedish fighter pilots. It was a lot. It was a lot they had to do.
Air forces generally look at developing a flexible, adaptive and global air force within budgetary constraints through a focus on multi-role training enablers such as tankers and AWACS and a mix of training experience. Sweden, because of its geographical location as a regional actor, its defense needs and its dispersed posture that requires operators to display personal initiative, make decisions and have a substantive understanding of the tactical situation for them and others, it places a much higher emphasis on the individual pilot and small 2 to 4 ship formations rather than the system as a whole. Of course, the system itself is still important, but the reliance on it is less pronounced because that would make the dispersed operations vulnerable in the first place.
That also necessitates training their crews in a very different way from the way most European air forces or indeed global air forces train, because it implies a very high level of responsibility and mission complexity for in terms of briefing as well and planning as well as flying. In particular, also potentially planning and replanning sorties at short notice in complex mission areas with limited communications and limited support crews. So even 2 ship leads or 4 ship leads have to be very, very capable. And as such, the Swedish Air Force doesn't have a tour system, for example, where in a lot of European air forces like the RAF, or in the US Air Force for that matter, fast jet crews will do typically 3 years on a tour. Now they might do a couple of tours with a squadron, but typically they might move between squadrons, between bases, get experience in different roles. They may do ground tours or tours, for example, as a forward air controller or that kind of thing, and then come back to flying as a squadron commander maybe, or later as a wing commander. Whereas in the Swedish system, you join a fighter wing and you're expected to be there for 20 to 25 years. You're not expected to move, you're expected to put down roots, and essentially your career, primarily speaking, is with the squadron, or at least within the wing, which has a couple of squadrons typically. And so they have the luxury, therefore, of having this much more kind of in-depth and focused training package that goes over a decade to move up to where 2 ship leads might be 3 years in, for example, 4 ship leads maybe 6 years in. If you're good, you might be trained as a 4 ship lead. Whereas compared to, say, the RAF or the US Air Force, 4 ship lead you might be expecting perhaps in your 2nd or 3rd year on squadron, and maybe even at that point, if you're very good, starting to train as a weapons instructor, which is sort of the store of tactical knowledge and and combat leadership, essentially, and expertise in weapon system employment and tactics. Whereas in the Swedish system, you don't start even being looked at as a potential weapons instructor or mission commander until you've been on a wing about 10 years. So
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to get into two things that are a little bit different here because they've touched on one and then they just touched on this one. The U.S. went through a radical shift after September 11th. So you can hear a million different U.S. veterans who were in the military in all different branches prior to September 11th and then post September 11th. And what they say to prior September 11th is basically the only people who were giving them information, like who were actually training them, that had real like experience with this stuff, like long-term experience, were like, you had some Vietnam vets, you had some of the initial like Desert Shield and stuff like that. But it was a lot of like, basically the Vietnam vets were the ones that had like the hardcore military experience, and they're old by this point, right? And so you are getting instruction in a lot of cases, and like I said, this is something you hear talked about a lot for pre-September 11th. You're getting instruction in a lot of cases from people who like it's sort of like they don't have like on the ground experience, or if they do, not a lot of it, right? And then you listen to those same people talk about what happened post September 11th, and you're like, yeah, a lot of this stuff we were learning beforehand, we threw all that stuff out because we realized, like, wow, it actually doesn't work whenever you're out in the field and you're actually fighting. It was sort of like it sounded good in theory and we thought it would work, right? It was like that sort of thing. But then post September 11th, you have all of these people who they've gone on tour, they've been active duty, they have been over fighting, and then they're coming back, and basically what they're doing when they come back in training is saying, like, yeah, this is what you learned, but that doesn't work. That's not going to work if you go try to do that in a real situation. So stop doing that in training. Like that sort of thing, right? So I can't speak for the British. I haven't heard really any reference to the British military in regards to their stuff in the Middle East, other than just soldiers' sort of experience over there. But I've heard that a lot from U.S. vets that were in the military pre-September 11th and post-September 11th, that it changed drastically. And the guys that came back were basically like, yeah, throw a lot of that shit out because it doesn't work over there. It doesn't work. So that's one thing. On the other side of it, I think that there is a happy medium that NATO needs to find with decentralized command, because a lot of the stuff that you see and hear about the big NATO team up, like trainings, are they're not great at it. They're sort of like clunky in their tactics and movement. And I've heard that quite a bit for like on the ground infantry training. I would assume it's the same in the air. And you can understand why. It's a bunch of people. They don't normally work together. There's, diplomacy issues and politics that get involved when it's all these different countries coming together and everything like that. But if you're actually like if you want to be in the best position for when a true conflict comes, lots of these NATO countries practice decentralized command much more individually. Like if they were to get into a conflict on their own with just their military, I feel like they practice decentralized command much more than it seems like they do when it's NATO as a whole. So I feel like maybe some sort of middle ground needs to be found there on just making NATO training and movement a little more fluid.
So it's a much slower, more in-depth progression, and they all do air-to-air to start with, and then kind of broaden that speciality once they're combat-ready air-to-air. But it results in an extremely flexible, adaptable fighter force that can do genuinely complex, high-intensity mission sets from a really dispersed posture with this decentralized kind of tactical command and control. At the same time, it's then quite vulnerable to personnel disruption, for example. So if you lose a bunch of people who retire early, or you're struggling for retention, then of course it takes much longer to potentially make good on that loss, or that under provision of trained pilots, because it takes you so much longer to train people to the standard you need.
So okay, we come to the big elephant in the room here, mentality. The Swedish Armed Forces, we can really say, and its Air Force in particular, have developed a specific mentality around national defense, and it's very different to other countries. Finland is the closest analog. Now, Sweden's model transcends even the military. There is that concept of total defense that covers how a country as a whole is going to operate and interact with each other in times of crisis.
Yeah, if you are not Swedish and watching this, we've done a whole bunch of videos on this, and that total defense thing for Sweden as a whole goes ridiculously deep.
Where that links to Gripen and the Air Force is both in training. We spoke about the levels of training of individual pilots and operators that they receive, but also in nurturing personal responsibility paired with initiative and, crucially, an appetite for calculated risks. That, if something does go wrong, and it will go wrong, serves more as a lesson rather than a reason for sanctioning or punishment. Take Sweden's main doctrine about joint operations, where it refers to this risk appetite multiple times. Here are just two examples. There are situations where operators must make decisions about risks as a result of the assignment given by a senior operator. Risks are analyzed and managed through the operation plan, and thus the risks are set against the context in which the operation will be carried out. It is in this context that we initially weigh our acceptance of risks related to the mission and its objectives. In the context of planning, we talk about the acceptable risk. An operator makes decisions about what and when something needs to be done. This means that the operator must make conscious choices about the method of decision making. For quick action, decisions must be made despite incomplete information. It assumes that opportunities are valued against risks. Big thank you here to the Swedish Air Force personnel that talked to me about this institutionalized ethos, and specifically Anton for pointing me in the direction of this open source publication. You are of course correct to say that other forces also take risks. I mean, it is indeed every single tactical, operational or strategic decision entails risks. However, there is, I would say, a difference to the degree that the Swedish Air Force manages and approaches risks as an institution. And that goes from the top echelons of officers to the single conscript. It's really not sort of this gung-ho disregard for risk. Rather, it is more about trusting in well-trained individuals to make decisions rather than subscribing them to certain procedures with the sole aim of minimizing all possible risks. This is an organizational culture that has been nurtured for many years. It's a generational thing, really. It's their smørrebrød. Yeah? They live and breathe this. NATO air forces don't. And this is one of the biggest obstacles in moving towards a Swedish model among NATO air forces.
There's a degree to which you could certainly radically improve the ability of European air forces to operate dispersed by changing procedures, permissions, practices, tactics, and particularly kind of cultural attitudes to risk. So things like watching the Swedes when I was up in the Arctic with them, doing rearming and refueling of aircraft, in some cases with the engine still running, by the side of a dispersal strip with teams of six, teams of six, 5 of whom are conscripts with 2 or 3 months training, winching up and down the weapons, refueling the aircraft, certifying it all to go with one highly skilled, 3 or 4 year minimum trained technician just supervising it.
Yeah, I don't know. That would make me nervous.
The permissions and the kind of authorizations to be required to do that, and who would hold the kind of risk that a system like the German system or the British system would perceive in that. There's nothing technically stopping us doing that, but it would be a huge cultural shift to enable us to move that way.
Now I want to know from you, what do you think about this topic? What are your opinions here? Be sure to check also the description for all my sources and the many ways.
Okay, so again, I think this really comes down to whether you're talking about NATO as a group or the individual countries. For individual countries, yeah, I feel like the biggest thing that I feel like was pushing people away from this, or countries away from this, was just the lack of a perceived major state threat. And so in the absence, or the sort of vacuum of a state threat that was there, I've talked about this before on the channel. I feel like after the USSR fell, there is this absolutely major shift that happens where world leaders, particularly in the West, get it in their heads that major state-on-state conflict is now a thing of the past. It's something that is a relic from a former world, that it's not a thing anymore. And so it sort of changes your your ideas and tactics and military spending and everything like that, as an individual country whenever your leaders sort of perceive the world that way, right? Also, if you're talking about NATO as a whole, like I mentioned earlier with the Desert Storm, there were so many planes from so many different countries that were doing all sorts of stuff whenever that conflict started, that there was like a checklist of things you had to do and questions you had to ask and getting confirmation before you shot at somebody that was, you know, you expected to be an enemy fighter, because they were trying to cut down on blue fighting or blue on blue casualties. And so if you're talking about NATO as a whole, I also think it's going to be hard to get out of there, that sort of stuff, because that is a lot of perceived risk. That not only is it like friendly fire, but it's friendly fire from another country that's your ally here. I feel like that's gonna be hard to do. But like I said, this whole conversation to me sort of depends on whether you're talking about NATO more broadly or the individual countries. And with the individual countries, it's really hard to put the US in here or to talk about what they'll do or not do, because they're sort of a wild card. They kind of do whatever the hell they want to, regardless of really what anybody else says or does, including their own citizens sometimes. So they're kind of a total wild card. But I thought this was a really great video. If you have any comments, questions, anything you want to tell me about this, put it down in the comments below, or you could join the Discord. That'll be in the description box below. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you all next time.